concept assembly line where ideas get to work. This week, the Trump administration announced a headline, grabbing new trade deal with Vietnam, a 20% blanket tariff on all Vietnamese imports, countered by zero tariffs on U.S. exports heading the other direction. Billed as a way to reduce the trade deficit and support American manufacturing, the deal was marketed as a win-win for U.S. workers and exporters. But behind the press conference, optics lies an economic boomerang. This isn't just a case of tariffs raising prices on foreign goods. It's a deeper structural shift, one that quietly weakens the dollar, raises prices across the board, and causes U.S. consumers to foot the bill twice. Once at the register, and again through a depreciated currency. Let's break down how. Tariffs are taxes on imports. A 20% blanket tariff on Vietnamese goods will immediately reduce the competitiveness of those goods in U.S. markets, particularly in categories where Vietnam plays an outsized role, like textiles, furniture, electronics, and certain agricultural products. As the volume of imports declines, either because U.S. buyers find domestic substitutes, switch to other trading partners, or reduce consumption altogether, so does the total amount of international trade conducted between the two countries. But what does this have to do with the dollar? To purchase U.S. goods, foreign firms need dollars. To sell goods to the U.S., foreign firms typically receive dollars. This global demand for U.S. dollars, for invoicing, settling, and holding reserves, is tightly linked to the volume of trade denominated in dollars. When tariffs shrink bilateral trade flows, foreign demand for dollars declines. With fewer Vietnamese goods flowing into the U.S., fewer Vietnamese arms exporters need to exchange their local currency for dollars. And with U.S. exports not increasing dramatically, since the current trade deficit is not driven by high tariff rates on U.S. exports, but rather on the relative poorness of the Vietnamese consumer relative to U.S. goods, there's no offsetting surge in dollar demand from U.S. sales. This dynamic puts downward pressure on the dollar's exchange rate relative to Vietnam's dong and potentially other currencies. If the dollar weakens even slightly, the price of all imported goods rises in dollar terms, not just the ones affected by tariffs. This is the inflationary feedback loop. A 20% tariff raises Vietnamese import prices. The resulting trade contraction weakens dollar demand. A weaker dollar pushes up the price of all foreign goods. U.S. consumers experience not just direct tariff inflation, but exchange rate inflation too. To Vietnamese exporters, the weaker dollar makes their goods cheaper to produce in local currency terms, offsetting part of the tariff-induced drop in exports volume. But to the American consumer, the price rises on both fronts, the tariff and the currency depreciation. In essence, we're taxing ourselves twice. At first glance, the deal sounds lopsided in America's favor. We tax their goods, they don't tax ours. But that imbalance actually hides a hidden subsidy. Because U.S. consumers are absorbing both the tariff cost and the effects of a weaker dollar, the real burden is shifted back onto U.S. households. In turn, Vietnamese exporters gain partial relief through favorable exchange rate shifts, meaning part of the tariff is effectively refunded through currency mechanics. In classical trade theory, this is called tariff incidence, who bears the economic burden of a trade tax. And in this case, it's not just the exporter. The most ironic outcome? Tariffs are often justified as a way to counter inflation by boosting domestic production. But in reality, this type of policy introduces imported inflation without providing any of the demand-side stimulus that would normally accompany price increases, e.g., infrastructure spending or wage subsidies. It's inflation without a raise, stagflation, higher prices without more capacity, a weaker dollar without stronger exports. and all in the name of winning a trade deal. One of the enduring myths used to defend tariffs is that they generate revenue the government can use to offset other taxes or shrink the deficit. But this assumes that the federal government is financially constrained in the way households or states are. It's not. The federal government is the issuer of the US dollar, not merely a user of it. It doesn't need to raise revenue before it can spend. In fact, spending comes first, and taxation, or tariffs, or bond sales comes second, not as funding mechanisms, but as tools to manage demand, regulate inflation, or alter behavior. Tariffs, then, are not a way to pay for anything. They don't unlock new fiscal space. They don't offset deficits. They merely shift cost burdens with no real fiscal benefit to show for it. Even if tariffs raise revenue on paper, that revenue doesn't fund anything in operational terms. And because tariffs are inherently regressive, impacting lower-income households the most, the claim that they are a patriotic tool for rebuilding the economy or balancing the budget falls apart under scrutiny. This trade deal doesn't just fail on economic grounds. It fails even as optics if you understand how federal finance actually works. The new tariff regime with Vietnam may be politically popular within a subset of deliberately misled citizens, but its economic mechanics are regressive. It imposes rising costs on households without delivering proportionate benefits to workers or exporters. By triggering a currency effect that multiplies costs across all imports, not just those from Vietnam, it quietly turns a 20% tariff into something more like a 30% total price increase for certain goods. As always, the invisible hand of trade policy doesn't act in isolation. It moves with the currents of currency, capital, and consumer demand. And when tariffs disrupt those flows without building something new in their place, like capacity, infrastructure, or domestic supply chains, the result isn't strategic leverage. It's just inflation in disguise. This video is part of a broader project to reimagine public policy for real people, grounded in modern monetary theory, committed to abundance over austerity, and focused on rebuilding the freedom infrastructure of everyday life. If my work resonates with you, share it. Subscribe on YouTube for more multi-format content. Together, we can reclaim what was once built and build it back better.